You are walking now, one foot in front of the other, as you have been for hours. The weight of your pack digs into your shoulders, creating twin points of dull, throbbing pain that has long since become your constant companion. The wool of your uniform is scratchy against your skin, dampened by a persistent drizzle that began sometime in the night and shows no sign of relenting. It's not a hard rain that might almost be a relief, but rather a ceaseless mist that settles on everything, transforming the world into gradients of gray and brown. The road beneath your boots has disappeared, replaced by a churned path of mud that sucks at your feet with each step. You've been told this is France, but it could be anywhere equally miserable, equally featureless, equally stripped of anything that might remind you of home. The fields to either side, once planted with crops whose names you'll never know, have been transformed into wastes of mud and shell holes filled with stagnant water that reflects the colorless sky. Your breath comes in rhythmic puffs of vapor before your face. In, out, in, out. The sound of hundreds of men marching creates an odd symphony. The squelch of boots in mud, the jingle of equipment, the occasional cough or muttered curse. No one speaks much anymore. Words require energy, and energy is something to be conserved. Besides, what is there to say that hasn't been said already? The veterans among you, those who have survived a tour at the front and been rotated back after leave, say even less. Their silence speaks volumes. The smell of wet wool pervades everything. Your greatcoat, sodden with rain, weighs twice what it did when you were issued it at a depot whose name you've already forgotten. The smell mingles with other scents, unwashed bodies, tobacco, the faint metallic tang of gun oil from the rifle slung across your back, and underneath it all, something else, something you've never smelled before but somehow recognize intuitively, the smell of a place where men have died in great numbers. In the distance, there is a sound like summer thunder, but continuous, a rolling grumble that never quite fades. Artillery. Your sergeant told you that you'd get used to it, that after a while you'd be able to distinguish between outgoing and incoming shells, between danger and relative safety. Right now, it all sounds like the end of the world, playing out in slow motion beyond the horizon. You've been marching since before dawn. The letter from your mother is still in your breast pocket, already softening from the damp, despite your efforts to keep it dry. You wonder if you'll have a chance to write back before what? Before you reach the front, before you see combat, before you die. The thought comes unbidden, unwelcome, and yet impossible to banish. Statistically speaking, you know the odds. The mathematics of modern warfare are brutal and unforgiving. The column halts abruptly, men shuffling to a stop, like a great weary beast, settling into stillness. Word passes down the line, a 10-minute rest. You sink gratefully to your haunches, careful to find a spot that seems marginally less muddy than the surrounding earth. From your pack, you extract a tin of bully beef and a hardtack biscuit. The biscuit is so hard you fear for your teeth, but when softened in tea, it becomes almost palatable. There is no tea now, though, so you gnaw at it cautiously, feeling it scrape against the roof of your mouth. A man to your left offers you a cigarette. You take it with murmured thanks, though you were not a smoker before the war. Now, the harsh tobacco is a comfort, a small pleasure in a world increasingly devoid of pleasures. The smoke burns your lungs, but the sensation is almost welcome. A reminder that you are still alive, still capable of feeling something beyond exhaustion and dread. The rest period ends too quickly. The order comes to form up, to continue the march. Joints cracking, muscles protesting, you rise and take your place in the endless column of men. The rain continues to fall, pattering gently on your helmet, running in rivulets down the back of your neck. The sound of the distant guns seems louder now, more insistent. You are getting closer. As you march, the landscape begins to change subtly. Trees become scarcer, and those that remain are often shattered, their trunks splintered, branches reaching toward the sky like pleading fingers. Buildings appear occasionally, farmhouses, barns, small outbuildings, but they too bear the marks of war. Roofs collapsed, walls pockmarked with bullet holes or partially destroyed by shell fire. Sometimes you pass the remains of villages, clusters of rubble where people once lived and worked and loved. The road is increasingly congested now. Your column passes ambulances heading in the opposite direction, canvas covers concealing their cargo of broken men. Supply wagons lumber toward the front, horses straining against the mud, drivers hunched and grim-faced beneath the rain. Occasionally staff cars speed past, spattering unfortunate soldiers with mud, earning muttered curses that die quickly for fear of being overheard by an officer. You've stopped trying to keep track of time, to count the hours or guess at the distance covered. It seems pointless now. This measurement of normal life, time has become elastic, stretching and contracting according to laws you no longer understand. All you know is the rhythm of the march. Left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot. The weight of your pack, the rub of your boot against a forming blister. The dampness that has penetrated every layer of clothing until it seems a part of you. The terrain becomes more broken as you approach the reserve lines. Shell holes pock the earth like a disease, filled with stagnant water that gleams dully in the fading light. The mud is deeper here, more treacherous. Men stumble, curse, are helped up by comrades, only to stumble again yards later. Your boots, which seemed so sturdy and well made when issued, now feel as insubstantial as paper against the sucking, clinging muck. Duckboards appear, rough wooden walkways laid across the worst stretches of mud, but they are slick with rain and often broken, requiring careful navigation. A man ahead of you steps wrong, his foot plunging through a rotted board into knee-deep mud below. His friends haul him out, his boot remaining behind, swallowed by the earth. He continues with one foot bound in a rag torn from someone's spare shirt. The smell changes again. The dampness remains, the wet wool and unwashed bodies, but now there are other odors layered atop them. The reek of latrines, dug too close to living areas, the sharp chemical tang of disinfectants used to combat disease, the cloying sweetness of decomposition. This last you try to ignore, try to convince yourself, is something else. Perhaps the scent of some unfamiliar French flower that blooms even in this desolation. But deep down, you know better. As darkness falls, your column reaches its destination for the night, a staging area several miles behind the front lines proper. Tents have been erected in haphazard rows, sagging under the weight of rain. Cook fires burn fitfully, tended by men who look as if they have forgotten what warmth feels like. The ground is a sea of mud, churned by thousands of boots into a morass that seems malevolently alive, eager to claim the unwary. You are assigned to a tent that already holds twice as many men as it was designed for. Inside, the air is thick with the smell of damp humanity, tobacco smoke, and the lingering ghosts of meals past. You find a space, barely large enough for your body, wedged between a corporal who coughs continuously and a private who stares at nothing, his eyes reflecting no light. You remove your pack with relief, massage your shoulders briefly, then set about the nightly ritual of checking your equipment. Your rifle, a Lee Enfield, that has become more familiar to you than the contours of your own face, must be cleaned, even though you have not fired it today. The damp is an enemy to the mechanism, causing rust that could make the difference between life and death. When you finally reach the front, you break it down methodically, wiping each part with an oily rag, reassembling it with fingers that know their work even in the dim light of the tent. Around you, other men perform similar rituals. Some write letters by the light of candle stubs, pencils moving laboriously across paper. Others play cards, gambling for cigarettes or small coins, their voices low, their laughter forced. A few simply lie on their ground sheets, staring upward, perhaps counting the hours until dawn, perhaps praying, perhaps thinking of nothing at all. Sleep, when it comes, is fitful. The ground beneath your ground sheet is uneven, lumpy. The rain continues to fall, drumming on the canvas above, occasionally finding its way through worn patches to drip steadily onto unwary sleepers. Men snore, mutter in their dreams, occasionally cry out before being shaken awake by neighbors. Outside, vehicles continue to move, their engines growling in the darkness. The artillery never ceases, a distant thunder that vibrates in your bones even as exhaustion finally pulls you under. Morning comes too soon, heralded by whistles and shouted orders. You rise stiffly, every muscle protesting, joints cracking like rifle fire. Breakfast is tea, strong, sweet, and scalding hot, accompanied by bread that seems to have been baked days ago, and bacon that contains more fat than meat. You eat mechanically, knowing that you need the energy, trying not to think about the day ahead. The column forms up once more. The rain has stopped, but the sky remains leaden, promising more to come. The mud is, if anything, worse than yesterday, as if it has been breeding overnight, expanding its dominion. Your boots, which you tried unsuccessfully to dry near a cook fire, are still damp, the leather stiff and unyielding against your feet. Today's march is shorter, but more arduous. The terrain becomes increasingly broken, the evidence of war more pronounced. You pass artillery batteries set up in hastily dug emplacements, the massive guns pointing toward the enemy lines, crews moving around them with the practiced efficiency of men who have done the same tasks countless times. The concussion when a gun fires is physical, a pressure wave that seems to pass through your body, leaving momentary deafness in its wake. The communication trenches begin some distance behind the front line proper. These zigzagging pathways, cut deep into the earth, will lead you to your destination. They are narrower than you expected, the walls held back by wooden frames and corrugated iron in places, bare earth in others. The floor is a mixture of duckboards and sucking mud. In places, the trench is so narrow that your equipment scrapes against both walls as you pass. The smell in the trenches is different again, concentrated, trapped by the earthen walls, unable to dissipate. It is a complex miasma of mud, human waste, rotting sandbags, cordite, cooking fires, unwashed bodies, and death. This last is stronger now, unmistakable. It clings to the back of your throat, seeming to coat your lungs with each breath. You have never smelled anything like it before, and yet some primitive part of your brain recognizes it instantly, triggering an atavistic fear response that you struggle to control. The communication trench seems endless, winding back and forth in a pattern designed to prevent enemy fire from sweeping its length. The walk that might have taken minutes across open ground stretches into hours as you shuffle along, pack bumping against the trench wall, rifle held awkwardly to avoid catching it on protruding timbers or the occasional telephone wire strung along crude brackets. Periodically, The trench widens into recesses, where wounded men wait for stretcher bearers, their faces gray beneath the mud, their bandages already soaked through with blood turned brown. They watch you pass with eyes that seem to belong to much older men, saying nothing, asking nothing. What could they say? What could you offer them beyond platitudes that would ring false in this place of truth? The sound of the guns is constant now, no longer distant thunder, but immediate, visceral. The ground trembles beneath your feet with each shell that lands nearby. The air is periodically split by the distinctive crack whine of rifle fire, followed by the answering chatter of machine guns. These are no longer abstract concepts, but immediate realities, the instruments of death at work, just yards away. As you move closer to the front, you begin to encounter the men you will replace. They are returning from their stint in the forward trenches, making their way to the rear for a brief respite before the cycle begins again. They are almost unrecognizable as men, mud-encrusted figures with hollow eyes and movements that suggest automated machinery rather than living flesh. They regard your relatively clean uniforms and alert expressions with a mixture of amusement and pity. "Fresh meat," you hear one mutter as he passes, the words not meant for your ears, but carrying nonetheless. Another, noticing your apprehension, offers advice in a voice made hoarse by gas and cigarettes. "Keep your head down, don't volunteer. The rats won't bother you if you don't bother them." Others saying nothing at all, conserving energy for the long walk back to relative safety, moving with the careful deliberation of men who have learned that hurrying only wastes strength that might be needed later. The light begins to fade as you near your destination. In the trenches, darkness comes earlier, the high walls cutting off the sky, except for a narrow strip directly overhead. Officers move among you now, assigning sections, explaining duties in voices that strive for confidence, but occasionally betray the strain of responsibility for lives. You learn the schedule of watches, the location of the nearest aid station, the signal for gas attack, the procedure for reporting enemy movement, and finally, you arrive. The front-line trench, your home for the next week, or however long you survive. It is not what you expected, neither better nor worse, simply alien. A world of mud walls and low ceilings, of sandbagged firing steps and crude dugouts carved into the forward wall. A world measured in yards of territory and minutes between shells. A world where the enemy, who you have been trained to hate and fear, exists unseen, just yards away across a stretch of churned earth, designated simply as no man's land. You are shown to your section by a corporal whose age is impossible to determine beneath the grime and stubble. He points out your firing position, the dugout where you'll sleep when not on watch, the location of the latrine, the small niche where brewing tea is permitted during quiet periods. He speaks in a monotone, reciting information he has delivered to countless men before you, many of whom are now names on crosses, or simply vanished into the insatiable mud. Night falls completely, bringing not darkness, but a different kind of light, the sporadic illumination of flares that arch over no man's land, casting harsh white light and deep, disorienting shadows before dying away. In their glow, you catch glimpses of the wasteland beyond the parapet, tangles of barbed wire, shell holes filled with stagnant water, the occasional dark shape that might be a fallen tree or something far worse. The artillery continues through the night, though at a reduced tempo that veterans assure you is normal. Somewhere to your left, a machine gun fires brief, probing bursts. Periodically, rifles crack from the German lines, the bullets whining overhead or thudding into the sandbags with a sound like a fist, striking wet cloth. You stand at your post, rifle ready, peering into the darkness, seeing shapes move that might be men or might be tricks of your exhausted mind. The night stretches endlessly. Your legs ache from standing, your back from the weight of equipment you dare not remove, your eyes from straining to see through darkness, broken only by the harsh, temporary glare of flares. When your watch finally ends, you stumble to the dugout, find a space on the dirt floor, and collapse, too exhausted even to remove your boots. Sleep comes quickly, but brings no rest. Your dreams are filled with the sounds of artillery, the sensation of mud encasing your limbs, the faces of men you passed on the communication trench, their eyes accusing, their mouths forming words you cannot hear. You wake frequently, disoriented, unsure for moments where you are, until the reality crashes back, almost worse than the nightmare. And so the pattern is established. Watch, rest, eat when food is available, clean your rifle, write letters home, full of lies about your conditions and spirits, sleep when exhaustion overcomes discomfort. Days blur into one another, marked only by the changing quality of light, filtering down into the trench, night, day, dusk, dawn, all rendered in gradients of gray, beneath the ever-present cloud cover. You are in the trenches now, truly in them, becoming part of them. The mud is no longer something you march through, but something that defines your existence, that works its way into every crevice of your body and equipment, that you breathe and eat and dream about. You are learning the rhythms of this strange subterranean world, its dangers and its rare comforts, its unwritten rules and silent understandings. And somewhere deep inside, in a place you try not to acknowledge, a question forms: how long can you survive here? How many days before a shell finds you, before a sniper's bullet strikes with mathematical precision, before disease claims you, before you make the fatal mistake born of exhaustion or momentary carelessness? The question has no answer, and so you push it down, focus on the immediate, the concrete, the next step, the next breath, the next hour. This is how it begins, not with heroism or grand purpose, but with mud and discomfort and fear carefully contained. This is how men have come to the trenches since the lines stabilized in late 1914, and how they will continue to come until the war grinds to its eventual conclusion. This is your introduction to a world that will change you irrevocably if you survive it at all. The march to the mud is complete. You have arrived at the place where history is being written in blood and suffering. You are now part of that history, whether you wish to be or not. One more anonymous figure in a war of millions, standing in a trench that stretches for hundreds of miles across the tortured landscape of Northern Europe. One more set of eyes staring into the darkness, one more finger on a trigger, one more heart beating with mingled fear and determination. You have reached the front lines of the Great War, and now the real test begins. The trench becomes your world, your universe contracted to a narrow channel of earth, approximately 7 feet deep and 6 feet wide. By your third day, you've memorized every feature of your section: the slight bulge in the eastern wall where water seeps through after heavy rain, the charred post where someone once tried to build a small fire despite regulations, the crude steps cut into the clay that lead to the firing platform. These landmarks become your constants in a world where little else remains stable. The walls themselves seem alive, breathing entities, rather than mere excavations in the French countryside. After rainfall, they exhale moisture, beads of water forming like perspiration on a fevered brow. In drier periods, they shed skin, flakes of dirt cascading down in miniature landslides whenever a shell lands nearby or someone brushes too close. The constant maintenance required to prevent collapse creates an intimate relationship between you and these muddy barriers that stand between you and German bullets. Sandbags line the parapet, stacked 3 or 4 high, some new and taut with their contents, others old and rotting, split and spilling their innards down the trench wall. Between watches, you and your section are tasked with replacing the worst of them, filling new bags with earth dug from the floor of the trench, a Sisyphean task that never ends. As soon as one section is repaired, another deteriorates, an endless cycle of decay and renewal that mirrors the war itself. The floor of the trench defies description. It is not merely muddy, not simply wet. It is a substance unto itself, a semi-liquid terrain that bears as much resemblance to normal earth as the moon does to a penny. In places where duckboards have been laid, movement is possible, albeit treacherous. The wooden slats, slick with mud and often broken, require constant attention, lest a misplaced step send you sprawling. In sections without duckboards, each step becomes a calculation, a gamble against the sucking grip of the mud that can hold a boot fast enough to require the assistance of comrades to extract it. Water is the great enemy, more persistent than the Germans, more destructive than artillery. It gathers in the lowest points of the trench, creating pools that must be drained through channels laboriously dug during quieter periods. When rain falls heavily, these pools expand, sometimes covering the duckboards, forcing you to wade through knee-deep, filthy water that soaks your puttees and trousers. During your first night storm, you watch in horrified fascination as the water level rises inch by inch, bringing with it floating debris, cigarette butts, scraps of paper, occasionally more disturbing items, a glove with no owner, a fragment of equipment whose purpose you can no longer identify. The smell becomes a part of you, so pervasive that you cease to notice it until some small variation brings it back to conscious awareness. It is a complex bouquet of decay, wet earth, rotting sandbags, human waste from latrines that are never far enough away, the lingering chemical taint of explosives, the metallic note of blood, and underneath it all, the sweet sour reek of death. Bodies buried in shallow graves or incorporated into the trench walls themselves during hasty repairs release their gases, slowly, a constant reminder of your potential fate. Rats thrive in this environment, not the relatively small rodents you might have encountered in civilian life, but enormous specimens, fat on a diet of garbage and worse things. They move with brazen confidence, scurrying along the fire step, emerging from holes in the walls, sometimes running across sleeping men who wake with shouts of disgust and fear. Attempts to eliminate them prove futile. For every rat killed, 3 more seem to appear, an endless tide of glistening fur and naked tails. Your first encounter with a rat occurs during your second night. On watch, staring into the darkness beyond the parapet, you feel something brush against your boot. Looking down, you see a rat the size of a small cat, its eyes reflecting the distant flare of a star shell, utterly unafraid of your presence. When you kick at it, it retreats a few feet, then continues its journey along the trench floor, purpose-driven and indifferent to your horror. Later, you witness 2 rats fighting over something clutched in one's jaws, a finger severed and blackened with decay. The struggle is brief, vicious, and conducted in complete silence, save for the scrabble of claws on wood and the soft impact of furry bodies hitting the trench wall. The victor disappears into a hole with its prize, leaving you to stare at the empty space where this nightmare tableau played out, wondering if you imagined it. The veterans assure you that you'll get used to the rats, that after a while they'll become just another feature of trench life, like the mud and the shells and the constant gnawing fear. You don't believe them, but within a week, you find yourself merely stepping over the creatures, rather than recoiling, too exhausted to maintain the energy required for revulsion. Lice arrive more subtly than rats, but prove equally persistent. You first notice the itching at your collar, your wrists, the waistband of your trousers, places where clothing fits most snugly against skin. Examining the seams of your uniform, you find them tiny, pale insects that scatter when exposed to light. The discovery that you are host to parasites brings a shame that feels peculiarly civilian, a remembrance of your mother's voice insisting on cleanliness, on the dignity of a body that houses only itself. Veterans show you their method of dealing with lice, running the seams of clothing over the flame of a candle or match, listening for the tiny pops as the creatures expire, a sound they name the music of the trenches with grim humor. This provides temporary relief at best. Within days a new generation has hatched, and the cycle begins again. Some men give up the struggle entirely, scratching constantly, their skin raw and infected from fingernails that carry the filth of the trenches. The combination of constant dampness and poor circulation creates the condition the medical officers call trench foot, a slowly developing agony that begins with numbness and progresses to swelling, blisters, open sores, and in severe cases, gangrene requiring amputation. You are ordered to change your socks daily, to massage your feet with whale oil, to ensure circulation by removing boots periodically during quiet periods. These precautions help, but cannot eliminate the risk entirely. The environment itself is the enemy, and it cannot be defeated. Your first sight of trench foot comes when a man from another section removes his boot to apply the prescribed whale oil. His sock, when peeled away, reveals a foot that barely resembles a human appendage, swollen to half again its normal size, the skin macerated and white in places, angry red in others, with black areas that speak of tissue already dead. The smell that rises from this ruined flesh is distinct from the general miasma of the trench, sharper and more immediate. The man catches your stare and smiles grimly. "Keep your feet dry, new fish," he advises, his voice oddly detached. "This ain't even bad yet. Wait till it starts to rot proper." Sleep becomes a precious commodity, harder to obtain than cigarettes or rum. The dugouts cut into the sides of the trench offer some shelter from the elements, but little comfort. The earth floor, covered with a ground sheet if you're lucky, becomes your bed. The low ceiling, supported by timbers salvaged from destroyed buildings or shipped from England, creaks ominously with each nearby shell impact, raining dirt onto your face. In wet periods, water seeps through, creating a constant drip that your exhausted mind incorporates into dreams, transforming it into ticking clocks or the footsteps of approaching enemies. The rhythm of the front line dictates your rest periods, 2 hours on watch, 4 hours off, in theory. In practice, working parties, ration distribution, and the random crises of trench warfare interrupt even these brief respites. You learn to sleep in snatches, fully clothed, your rifle within arm's reach, ready to respond instantly to the cry of "Stand to," that signals potential enemy activity. Dreams, when they come, are vivid and disturbing, not nightmares of combat, as you might expect, but surreal visions of home, distorted by the realities of your current existence. You sit at your family's dining table, but the food squirms with maggots. You walk familiar streets that gradually transform into flooded trenches. You speak with loved ones whose faces slowly melt into the featureless masks of gas attack victims. You wake from these dreams more exhausted than when you fell asleep, your mind offering no escape from the horrors it has absorbed. Food arrives irregularly, carried up from the rear areas in large metal containers that are meant to keep it warm but rarely succeed. The menu varies little: tough beef, undercooked potatoes, bread that seems perpetually stale, tea that tastes of tin and chlorination tablets. Occasionally there are treats: jam, a tin of condensed milk, cigarettes that haven't been soaked by rain. These small luxuries acquire an importance that would seem absurd in civilian life, becoming the subject of intense negotiation and barter. Eating becomes a mechanical act, devoid of pleasure or anticipation. You consume what is provided because you must maintain your strength, because it breaks the monotony, because it is one of the few normal human activities still available to you. The food itself is almost incidental, a means to an end rather than an experience to be savored. The latrines are perhaps the most dreaded feature of trench life. Located inside trenches, dug specifically for the purpose, they consist of little more than a pole suspended over a pit, offering minimal privacy and comfort. The smell is overpowering, particularly in summer when the heat accelerates decomposition. Flies gather in black clouds, moving between the latrine and the trench kitchen with horrible impartiality, carrying disease with every journey. Using the latrine requires timing and courage, timing to avoid the periods of heaviest shelling when exposure above trench level is most dangerous, courage to overcome the natural revulsion at the conditions. Some men, particularly during periods of intense bombardment, resort to empty ration tins used in the relative safety of the dugouts, a practice officially discouraged but widely understood. Disease spreads easily in these conditions. Dysentery is common, leaving men weak and dehydrated, forced to choose between the danger of frequent latrine visits and the humiliation of soiling themselves. Respiratory infections sweep through the trench in waves, transmitted by coughing men confined in close quarters. Infected wounds fester. Despite the best efforts of medical officers, the bacteria of the trench environment proving stronger than the antiseptics available. Each day follows a pattern that becomes ritual, a liturgy of survival that structures time in the absence of normal markers. Stand to at dawn, when enemy attacks are considered most likely, every man at his post, watching the thinning darkness for movement. Breakfast follows: tea, bread, perhaps bacon, if supplies have arrived. Then the day's tasks: repairing damaged sections of the trench, cleaning weapons, writing letters home full of reassurances and omissions, brief periods of rest when possible. As dusk approaches, another stand to, watching for the enemy, who might use failing light to mask an advance. Darkness brings a different rhythm: sentry duty, patrols into no man's land for some unlucky few, maintenance work that cannot be performed safely during daylight hours, when enemy observers might direct artillery fire onto visible activity. The night is punctuated by flares, by sporadic rifle fire, by the dull crump of trench mortars, sounds that once provoked terror, but now form a familiar acoustic landscape. The Germans across no man's land are phantoms, rarely seen directly but constantly present in your awareness. Occasionally you catch glimpses: a helmet visible for a moment above their parapet, the flash of a sniper's rifle, dark figures moving through the wire during night patrols. More often, you perceive them through their effects: the precise holes drilled through sandbags by their bullets, the distinctive sound of their artillery, the wreckage of your trench after a particularly accurate bombardment. In quiet periods, their humanity becomes more apparent. You hear them singing in the evening, the unfamiliar language carried across the blasted ground between trenches. You see the smoke from their cooking fires, smell occasionally the scent of their coffee, different from the tea that forms your own stimulant. In some sectors, informal truces develop, agreements not to fire during mealtimes, warnings shouted before artillery arrives, the exchange of insults that contains a peculiar camaraderie born of shared misery. These glimpses of normal human interaction make the return to killing all the more surreal. One day, you might exchange cigarettes with a German patrol, accidentally encountered in the fog of no man's land, both sides agreeing to report no contact. The next, you might be ordered to fire into their trench without pause, to throw grenades into their dugouts, to cut down their stretcher bearers with machine gun fire. The cognitive dissonance is profound, a fracturing of moral certainty that leaves many men silent and withdrawn during quiet periods, unable to reconcile their actions with their pre-war understanding of right and wrong. Time loses meaning in the trenches. Days blur together, distinguished only by variations in weather, in the intensity of artillery fire, in the quality of rations. You mark time by the rotation schedule, 6 days in the front line, 6 in support trenches slightly further back, 6 in reserve. Then the cycle begins again, except when it doesn't, when strategic necessity or manpower shortages keep you in the front line beyond your allotted time, stretching endurance to breaking point and beyond. Letters from home arrive sporadically, bundles of them delivered all at once or none for weeks. They come from another world, filled with concerns and joys that seem increasingly alien to you. Your mother writes of neighbors' children, of church socials, of her garden, your father of politics and local news, perhaps a sweetheart of dances attended and films seen. You read these missives with a sense of disconnect, unable to bridge the gulf between their reality and yours. Replying becomes an exercise in creative fiction. You cannot tell them of the rat that ran across your face as you slept, of the corpse uncovered when a shell collapsed, part of the trench wall, of the sound a man makes when machine gun fire tears through his abdomen. Instead, you write of adequate food, of friendly comrades, of confidence in victory. You ask questions about their lives to fill the page without revealing the emptiness of your own. The lies exhaust you almost as much as the fighting. The arrival of a new draft of replacements highlights how much you have changed. You see in their clean uniforms and alert expressions a reflection of yourself weeks or months ago, and the contrast with your present state is shocking. When had you stopped flinching at shell explosions? When had the sight of a man with half his face torn away ceased to provoke vomiting? When had death become not a tragedy, but merely an administrative inconvenience, necessitating paperwork and the redistribution of equipment? The veterans who seemed so callous, so detached when you arrived, now make perfect sense to you. Their economy of emotion, their dark humor, their focus on immediate physical needs rather than abstract causes or distant futures, these are not character flaws, but survival mechanisms, adaptations to an environment where anything more would lead to madness. And you realize, with a clarity that feels like waking from a long dream, that you have become one of them. You are no longer the fresh-faced recruit who marched toward the sound of the guns with a head full of patriotic nonsense and a heart full of apprehension. You are a trench soldier now, distinguished by your 1,000-yard stare, your reflexive duck at the distinctive whistle of an incoming shell, your ability to sleep on mud while artillery pounds the earth around you. The walls of the trench have shaped you as surely as water shapes stone, wearing away what was unnecessary, leaving only what will endure. You have been reduced and concentrated, stripped of illusions, focused on the essentials of survival. You have adapted to conditions that would have seemed impossible in civilian life. Develop tolerances for discomfort, fear, and moral ambiguity that would have horrified your former self. And yet, beneath the mud and the lice and the calluses of experience, something of that former self remains, a capacity for wonder that surfaces at unexpected moments. The stark beauty of a flare, illuminating no man's land, transforming the blasted landscape into a monochrome etching of light and shadow. The simple pleasure of a cigarette shared with a comrade during a quiet watch. The perfect blue of the sky, on rare clear days, stretching above the narrow confines of the trench like a promise of spaces beyond war. These moments sustain you, remind you that there is still something within that the trench has not claimed, but they grow fewer as days pass, as comrades are killed or wounded, as the grinding monotony of fear and discomfort wears away at your capacity for anything beyond mere existence. The walls continue to breathe, to shed their skin, to close in incrementally with each rainfall, each shell impact, each moment of your diminishing humanity. This is your world now, a 6-foot-wide universe of mud and death, of walls that breathe and floors that shift beneath your feet, of rats and lice and the constant maddening drip of water. This is where you live, where you may die, where you have learned the true meaning of endurance beyond what you believed possible. This is the trench, and it has claimed you as surely as it has claimed millions before you, incorporating you into its muddy fabric, until you can no longer say with certainty where its substance ends and yours begins. And across no man's land, in another breathing trench, men just like you endure the same conditions, harbor the same fears, write the same lies to their families. The true enemy is not them, but the trenches themselves, the system that has placed you all here, the war that grinds on with implacable indifference to individual suffering. But this understanding brings no relief, no escape. The walls still breathe, the mud still claims, the shells still fall, and you endure, because endurance is all that remains to you. The order arrives with the rations. Tomorrow at dawn, your section will participate in an attack across no man's land. The objective is a German-held ridge, approximately 400 yards distant, currently obscured by the gentle fold of land between the opposing trenches. The briefing is conducted in the battalion commander's dugout, a relatively spacious excavation, shored up with timber, and furnished with a makeshift table over which a map is spread, weighted at the corners with empty shell casings. The colonel, a man whose age is difficult to determine beneath his mustache and the permanent creases fatigue has carved into his face, outlines the plan with a pointer that traces lines across the map. A preliminary bombardment will begin at midnight, focusing on the enemy wire and known machine gun positions. At 5:15 a.m. precisely, the bombardment will lift, shifting to targets further behind the German lines to prevent reinforcement. At that moment, 0 hour whistles will blow, and the first wave will go over the top. Your section is part of this first wave. The colonel emphasizes the importance of maintaining distance between men, 5 yards at minimum, to reduce casualties from single shell bursts, and the need to advance at a steady pace rather than running, which leads to exhaustion before reaching the objective. He speaks of covering fire, of consolidation once the position is taken, of the support that will follow the initial assault. His voice is matter-of-fact, as if describing a particularly complex cricket match, rather than an operation that will leave many of his listeners dead or maimed. Questions are minimal, perfunctory. What is there to ask that might change anything? The officers and NCOs who will lead the attack have seen similar operations before, know their bloody arithmetic. The fate of individuals is subordinate to the movement of units on the colonel's map, the colored pins that represent hundreds of living, breathing men reduced to arrow paths across paper landscapes. You return to your section of the trench in silence, the weight of tomorrow's dawn pressing upon you with physical force. Around you, men react to the news with varied rituals of preparation. Some clean their rifles with obsessive thoroughness, as if the perfect functioning of their weapon might make the difference between life and death. Others write letters to be delivered in the event of their going west, a euphemism that has replaced more direct references to death. A few seek the numbing embrace of rum, issued in extra rations before an attack, its harsh burn offering temporary escape from anticipation. Others pray, quietly or in whispered groups, finding comfort in words learned in childhood, in the promise of meaning beyond the mud and metal of the trenches. Some simply sit, staring at nothing, already withdrawn from a world that may claim them with the coming light. You check your equipment methodically, rifle cleaned and oiled, bayonet secured, ammunition pouches full, water bottle filled, gas mask in its canvas case positioned for quick access. These practical tasks occupy your hands while your mind circles the void of tomorrow, approaching and retreating from the knowledge that waits there. Night falls with unnatural slowness, each minute stretching as if reluctant to yield to the next. The usual sounds of the trench, coughing, murmured conversations, the scurry of rats, are muffled, subsumed by a collective holding of breath. Even the sporadic rifle fire from the German lines seems diminished, as if they too sense the coming storm and conserve their energy for the clash that waits in darkness. At midnight, the preliminary bombardment begins with a roar that seems to tear the fabric of night itself. The ground beneath you trembles continuously, as hundreds of artillery pieces send their payloads arcing toward the German lines. The flashes illuminate the clouds from beneath, creating a flickering, hellish ceiling above the battlefield. The noise is not merely loud but physical, a battering pressure against your eardrums that makes normal speech impossible, reducing communication to shouts directly into ears or exaggerated gestures. Through the night, this artificial thunder continues. Occasionally, German shells reply, seeking out the batteries that pound their positions, but the weight of metal is disproportionate. This is what the officers call artillery superiority, the ability to deliver more destruction than the enemy can answer, a cold comfort to those who will cross the ground, being churned by these same shells. You try to sleep during your off-watch hours, knowing you will need every scrap of energy for the morning, but rest is fragmentary at best. Each time consciousness begins to fade, a particularly close impact jerks you back to wakefulness, adrenaline surging through your system in a flood of alertness that takes long minutes to subside. Your dreams, when they come, are chaotic fragments, splinters of memory and fear that offer no respite. Around 4 a.m., extra rations arrive, tea laced heavily with sugar and rum, thick slices of bread spread with jam, cigarettes distributed with unusual generosity. You eat mechanically, tasting nothing, the food sitting uneasily in a stomach clenched with anticipation. The rum burns a path to your gut, spreading warmth that does little to dispel the cold certainty of what approaches with the dawn. At 4:30 a.m., the order comes to stand to. Men move to their positions along the fire step, checking equipment one final time, exchanging glances that communicate more than words could. Good luck. I'll be beside you if I don't make it. Tell them I wasn't afraid. A sergeant moves along the line, his voice steady as he confirms each man's readiness, offers a word of encouragement here, a clap on the shoulder there. His calm is either genuine or a masterful performance. Either way, it steadies the more visibly nervous among you. The artillery reaches a crescendo as 5 a.m. approaches, a hurricane of sound and fury directed at the German wire and forward positions. You wonder how anything could survive such a bombardment. Allow yourself the briefest hope that perhaps the attack will find only empty trenches, the enemy driven back by this preliminary hell. Veterans know better, say nothing to dispel this comforting fantasy, having seen too many attacks meet fully manned defenses despite hours of preliminary shelling. Ladders are positioned at intervals along the trench, simple wooden constructions that will provide the means to climb out into no man's land. They seem absurdly inadequate to the task, these rickety structures that bridge the gap between relative safety and exposed vulnerability. You find yourself staring at the one nearest your position, counting its rungs, calculating the seconds it will take to mount it and emerge into whatever waits above. Officers check their watches with increasing frequency as 0 hour approaches. The eastern sky has begun to lighten. Not yet dawn, but no longer full night. A grayness that reveals the trench in monochrome detail. The tense faces of your comrades, the scarred earth of the parapet, the thin mist that hovers just above ground level, ghostly tendrils waiting to envelop those who venture forth. At 5:10, the artillery lifts as predicted, the shells now falling beyond the German front line, creating a barrier to reinforcement. The sudden reduction in noise is almost as shocking as the bombardment itself, not silence, for there is no true silence on the Western Front, but a lessening that allows the sound of breathing, of equipment shifting, of whispered prayers to emerge once more. Final orders pass down the line. Fix bayonets. Check gas masks. Prepare to advance at the whistle. The metallic snick of bayonets being attached to rifle barrels ripples through the trench, a sound both mundane and terrible in its implications. These are no longer tools for distance killing, but implements of intimate violence, designed to penetrate flesh at arm's length, to render the abstract enemy into dying men whose eyes meet yours as life leaves them. At 5:14, a curious calm descends. Time seems to stop entirely, each second frozen and distinct. You become aware of details previously unnoticed, a spider building its web in the angle between two sandbags, the particular pattern of stitches on the cuff of your tunic, the exact quality of the light as dawn approaches. Your breathing sounds unnaturally loud in your own ears. Your heartbeat is a drum that surely must be audible to those around you. 5:15. The whistles blow, a thin, piercing sound that cuts through the reduced artillery barrage like a knife. Officers rise first, scrambling up the ladders, drawing revolvers, turning to wave forward the men who follow. NCOs shout encouragement, obscenities, threats, whatever will move men from the relative safety of the trench into the exposed hell of no man's land. You move without conscious thought, your body responding to training and the implicit threat of being left behind, more alone than you would be advancing with your comrades. The ladder rungs are slick with mud, your boots struggling to find purchase as you climb. For a moment you are perfectly vulnerable, halfway out of the trench, silhouetted against the lightening sky, a target for any German marksman who has survived the bombardment. Then you are over the top, feet planted on the uneven ground of no man's land. Around you, other men emerge from the trench, forming a line that stretches left and right as far as visibility allows in the half-light and lingering smoke. The advance begins, a slow walk into uncertainty, each step carrying you further from safety and closer to the German wire that the artillery was meant to destroy, but which you can now see stands largely intact, a dark barrier between you and your objective. The first machine gun opens fire when you are perhaps 50 yards from your own trench. The sound is distinctive, not the crack of rifles, but a mechanical stuttering that seems almost industrial, a factory of death operating at maximum efficiency. You cannot see the gun itself, only its effects as men to your left crumple mid-stride, falling like marionettes whose strings have been cut, some immediately still, others thrashing in the mud, their screams adding a human counterpoint to the gun's mechanical voice. Training asserts itself. You drop to one knee, rifle raised, seeking a target that remains invisible. An officer's whistle, a shouted command. The advance continues, now with more urgency. You rise, move forward, each step an act of will that overrides the body's desperate instinct for self-preservation. Other machine guns join the first, creating interlocking fields of fire that seem to fill the air itself with lethal metal. The mud grabs at your boots, slowing progress, making each step a battle against the very earth. It is not merely soft, but actively resistant, as if the tortured ground itself opposes your passage. In places, shell holes filled with stagnant water force detours, breaking the neat line of advance into disjointed groups that struggle to maintain formation. You find yourself following a corporal whose name you cannot remember, trusting his determination to guide your own. A shell lands 20 yards to your right, close enough that the concussion stuns you momentarily, leaving your ears ringing and vision blurred. When your sense is clear, the corporal is gone, whether moved ahead or obliterated, impossible to determine in the chaos. You continue forward, because stopping is unthinkable, because the alternative is to remain alone in this wasteland, under increasingly accurate fire. The German wire looms closer now, a tangled mass of metal barriers designed specifically to halt your advance, to hold you in place while machine guns and rifles methodically reduce your numbers. Through gaps torn by artillery, you can see the German parapet beyond, occasional helmets visible, rifle barrels protruding through firing slits. The enemy is no longer abstract, but concrete, men like yourself who occupy the opposite role in this deadly theater. A bullet passes close enough to your head that you feel its displacement of air, a small pressure wave that registers as a primal warning. Another strikes the ground at your feet, spraying mud onto your puttees. The air seems increasingly solid with projectiles, the spaces between bullets narrowing with each yard gained. Men fall around you, some silently, others with cries that follow you forward, calls for mothers, for medics, for merciful completion of death already begun. You reach the wire at a point where shells have created a narrow passage, a funnel through which the attack must now proceed. The concentration of men at this choke point makes you a more valuable target. The German fire intensifies, methodically sweeping the gap. A man directly ahead of you spins, clutching his throat, blood pulsing between his fingers. You step over him, through him, your boots leaving prints in the mud, darkened by his life's final moments. Beyond the wire, the ground rises slightly toward the German trench. This gentle slope, barely noticeable in peacetime, now represents an almost insurmountable challenge. Open ground, fully exposed, to be crossed under direct fire from defenders who have weathered the preliminary bombardment and now emerge to repel your advance. Your legs feel leaden, each step requiring conscious effort, as if wading through invisible resistance. Time dilates, expands, becomes meaningless. What might objectively be seconds stretch subjectively into hours. You perceive each individual moment with hallucinatory clarity, the particular pattern of a shell burst against the lightening sky, the expression on the face of a man as a bullet finds him, the way the mud parts around your boot with each labored step. Somewhere in the background of awareness, You recognize this as the effect of extreme stress on perception, the brain's automatic response to mortal danger. A whistle blows somewhere behind you, the signal to deploy grenades. As you near the German position, you fumble at your belt, fingers clumsy with adrenaline and fear, extracting the heavy metal sphere that represents your contribution to the coming maelstrom. The pin is stiff, requiring more strength than you anticipated to extract. The spoon flips away, beginning the 5-second fuse that separates containment from chaos. You throw with all your remaining strength, watching the grenade arc toward the German trench, one of dozens now flying through the morning air. For a moment, there is anticipation, the collective held breath before impact. Then detonations blossom along the enemy line, clouds of smoke and debris erupting from the earth, the sound of explosions overlapping into a continuous roar. Through gaps torn in the German parapet, you catch glimpses of their dugout entrances, of figures moving in panic or purpose as the grenades wreak havoc on their position. The machine gun that has claimed so many lives falls silent momentarily, its crew perhaps killed or driven to cover by the barrage. This momentary respite allows a surge forward, men finding reserves of energy in the prospect of reaching the relative cover of the enemy trench. You are among them, stumbling the final yards, leaping into the German position with bayonet extended, landing heavily on earth, churned by your own artillery, and now by grenades. The trench is narrower than your own, less elaborately constructed, but still recognizable in its basic form. What differs is its population, the enemy made manifest, no longer distant targets, but men in field gray uniforms, who meet your intrusion with their own bayonets, with pistols, with entrenching tools wielded as desperate weapons. Combat at this range has nothing of the impersonal quality of rifle fire across no man's land. It is intimate, primal, reduced to the simplest equation of survival. Your bayonet meets resistance, cloth, then flesh, then something more solid that arrests its progress. The man at the other end of your rifle screams, a sound not of fear, but of rage and pain combined. His own weapon rises, falling short as strength leaves him, clattering to the trench floor as he follows it down. There is no time to process what has just occurred, no space for the moral reckoning that will come later, in quiet moments when memory reasserts itself. The fight continues around you, the trench becoming a chaotic battleground of individual struggles, of men locked in combat, so close they can smell each other's breath, see the dilation of pupils as life ends or continues based on fractional advantages of position, strength, or luck. Gradually, the resistance weakens. German defenders fall back to secondary positions, are killed where they stand, or surrender with hands raised, and fear clearly visible beneath the dirt and blood that coat their faces. Officers move through the captured trench, organizing its defense against the counterattack that will inevitably come, positioning machine guns taken from the enemy, directing the consolidation that will transform this temporarily claimed ground into a more permanent possession. You find yourself assigned to a former German firing position, rifle ready, watching for the counterattack across land that mirrors what you just traversed, the same mud, the same wire, now in reverse, with you as defender rather than attacker. The irony is not lost on you, though your capacity for appreciation of such things has been dulled by exhaustion and the lingering effects of combat. Around you, the wounded from both sides moan and call for aid. Stretcher bearers move through the trench, prioritizing by severity rather than uniform, their Red Cross armbands granting them a tenuous immunity from intentional fire. The dead lie where they fell, already beginning the process of incorporation into the mud that will eventually claim all traces of this struggle, rendering individual sacrifice into anonymous landscape. The counterattack, when it comes, is met with the same industrial determination that opposed your own advance. Machine guns sweep the ground between trenches, rifles crack in disciplined volleys, grenades arc toward clumps of advancing troops. You fire mechanically, without anger or enthusiasm, simply performing the task assigned, adding your contribution to the collective effort that will either repel the enemy or fall before their determination. This time, the attack falters before reaching the wire. German troops drop into shell holes for cover, becoming indistinct shapes in the broken ground, targets that appear and disappear with maddening irregularity. Eventually they withdraw, leaving their dead and severely wounded scattered across the same ground that claimed so many of your comrades hours earlier. As the day progresses into afternoon, a strange calm descends, not peace, for the artillery continues its distant dialogue, and snipers from both sides claim occasional victims, but a reduction in intensity that allows for basic functions. Water bottles are checked and shared, rations distributed, ammunition resupplied by runners from the rear areas. The wounded who can be moved are evacuated. Those too damaged for transport receive what comfort morphine and the attention of stretcher bearers can provide. You eat without tasting, drink without quenching thirst, reload your rifle without counting rounds. These actions occur at the level of muscle memory, requiring no conscious direction. Your mind has retreated to a place beyond immediate awareness, a protective withdrawal from the horrors it has witnessed and participated in. This dissociation is not unique to you. Looking at the faces of those around you, you see the same distant gaze, the same mechanical performance of necessary tasks. As evening approaches, orders arrive. The position will be held through the night, relief expected before dawn. You prepare for darkness with the automatic efficiency of the experienced soldier, positioning extra ammunition within easy reach, ensuring clear fields of fire, setting watch rotations with those still capable of remaining alert. The prospect of hours in this captured enemy trench, surrounded by the detritus of combat, holds no particular dread. The capacity for such emotional response has been temporarily exhausted. Darkness falls gradually, the twilight lingering, as if reluctant to conceal the day's work from view. Flares rise from both lines, their harsh light casting dramatic shadows that transform the battlefield into a tableau of grotesque sculptures, twisted wire gleaming like silver, shell holes rendered as perfect black circles, bodies frozen in postures that mimic sleep but cannot disguise their true condition. The night passes in alternating periods of hypervigilance and near unconsciousness, your body stealing moments of rest while never fully surrendering to sleep. Every sound from no man's land might herald another attack. Every shadow glimpsed in the intermittent illumination of flares might be an infiltrating enemy patrol. The mind, even in its exhausted state, cannot fully relinquish its grip on survival. Dawn brings the promised relief, fresh troops moving into the captured position, their clean uniforms and alert expressions, a stark contrast to your mud-encrusted, hollow-eyed condition. They avoid meeting your gaze directly, perhaps fearing contagion of whatever they see written there, perhaps simply acknowledging the gulf of experience that now separates you. The return journey to your original trench feels surreal, a walking dream conducted over ground that yesterday claimed so many lives, but now allows your passage without resistance. Shell holes that provided momentary shelter during the advance now appear as mundane features of the landscape, their significance reduced by the simple fact of your continued existence. The wire that presented such a fearsome barrier is now just tangled metal, its power to inspire dread temporarily neutralized. Reaching your own lines, you descend into the trench with a sensation approaching relief, though the emotion is too complex for simple naming. This muddy ditch, which yesterday represented confinement and vulnerability, now appears as a haven, a place of relative safety, where the immediate pressure of survival might ease enough to allow for reflection, for connection with comrades, for acknowledgement of what has occurred and what has been lost. Roll call reveals the cost of the morning's advance, nearly half your section missing, some confirmed dead, others wounded and evacuated, a few simply unaccounted for, perhaps lying in shell holes beyond reach of stretcher bearers, perhaps obliterated by direct artillery hits that leave no recognizable remains. Names are read, responses noted, or their absence marked, the administrative machinery of war grinding on with the same implacable rhythm as the artillery that still sounds in the distance. You clean your rifle methodically, removing the mud and worse substances that have accumulated during the attack. The bayonet requires special attention, its blade showing traces of dried blood that flake away under the oil-soaked rag. This task, like many in military life, serves practical purposes while simultaneously providing ritual comfort, the restoration of order in a small controllable domain amid the larger chaos of war. Later, seated on an ammunition box in a relatively quiet corner of the trench, you attempt to write home. The pencil hovers over paper, searching for words that might bridge the unbridgeable gap between here and there, between the person you were and the person you have become in the space of a single morning. In the end, you write only that you are well, that the food is adequate, that the weather has improved slightly. What else could you say that would not cause pain, that would not reveal the transformation that has occurred within you? A letter arrives as you seal your own, your mother's handwriting on the envelope, the paper smelling faintly of home, of normal life, preserved somewhere beyond the reach of artillery and machine guns. You open it carefully, preserving the envelope as if it might serve as a talisman against the realities that surround you. Her words describe a world that seems increasingly fictional. Village gossip, the garden's progress, a cousin's engagement. You read with the sensation of looking through a window into a place you once inhabited but can no longer quite believe exists. Night falls again, bringing with it the relative quiet of the front line between major operations. Tomorrow, you have been told, will be a day of rest. No attacks planned, only the routine maintenance of the trench and the usual watch rotation. The prospect should bring comfort, but instead creates a void in which thoughts and memories, held at bay during periods of immediate danger, now surge forward, demanding acknowledgement. Sleep, when it comes, is thin and populated with fragmented images from the attack. The moment your bayonet met resistance, the expression on the face of the German soldier as he fell, the peculiar stillness of the dead scattered across no man's land. You wake repeatedly, sweating despite the night's chill, heart racing from encounters with enemies who exist now only in memory, but whose presence feels more real than the quiet trench around you. Morning brings a gray sky, promising rain, the formation of water droplets on the trench walls, the resumption of the eternal battle against mud and collapse. You perform your assigned tasks with mechanical efficiency, your mind partially present, partially still processing the events of yesterday, cataloging experiences that will eventually be filed away, incorporated into the growing archive of moments that have transformed you from civilian to soldier. The whistle that launched you over the top now seems to exist in a different lifetime. Its thin, piercing note, the boundary between before and after. You have crossed no man's land and returned, But the journey has not been without cost. Something has been left behind in that churned earth, perhaps a piece of your humanity, perhaps the illusion that individual fate matters in the vast machinery of war, perhaps simply the person you were when the whistle blew. And though you stand now in the same trench from which you departed, though your body occupies the same approximate space it did before the attack, you have traveled a distance that cannot be measured in yards or miles. The journey across no man's land continues inside you, a slow-motion advance through territories of memory and meaning, guided by the echoing sound of a whistle that once heard can never be unheard. When the barrage finally lifts, the silence that follows is not truly silence at all. It is rather an absence, the removal of a pressure that has been so constant, so overwhelming, that its departure creates a vacuum in perception itself. Your ears, accustomed to the physical assault of artillery, register this reduction as a kind of negative sound, a space where something should be, but isn't, and into this space filter the smaller noises, the human soundtrack of warfare that exists beneath the industrial cacophony of shells, the groans of the wounded, the drip of water from trench walls, the occasional soft collapse of earth dislodged by concussion, the distant crackle of rifle fire that continues despite the artillery's pause. You have been crouching in a dugout for hours, pressed shoulder to shoulder with men whose faces have become as familiar as your own reflection, yet whose names sometimes escape you in the fog of exhaustion. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, fierce sweat, the distinctive metallic tang of artillery fumes that seep into every crevice, every fold of clothing, every pore of skin. As the realization of reduced shelling penetrates, men begin to stir, unfolding limbs cramped from holding defensive postures, brushing dirt from shoulders and helmets, checking equipment with hands that tremble slightly from the aftermath of prolonged stress. The sergeant's voice cuts through the tentative murmurs of survival. Stand to. They'll be coming now. The procedure is automatic, drilled into muscle memory through repetition and the stark reinforcement of consequence. You move to your assigned position along the fire step, rifle ready, eyes scanning the devastated landscape beyond the parapet for movement. No man's land lies before you, transformed yet again by the recent barrage, new shell holes pockmarking its surface, new tangles of wire where carefully planned paths once existed, new bodies adding to the grim decoration of ground already saturated with death. Minutes pass with excruciating slowness. The anticipated German advance does not materialize. Perhaps their artillery has not finished its preparation. Perhaps their officers have determined the moment unfavorable. Perhaps some communication has failed in their complex system of attack coordination. Whatever the reason, the immediate threat recedes, allowing a collective exhale that stops short of relief. Experience has taught that respite is always temporary, that the absence of immediate danger merely creates space for anticipation of its inevitable return. The lieutenant moves along the trench, his youth barely concealed beneath a carefully maintained mustache and the artificial confidence of command. He pauses at your position, eyes assessing, voice deliberately casual. Steady work. Private. How's your ammunition? You report your status automatically, the interaction following its prescribed form. His nod acknowledges both your response and your continued existence, a small ceremony of mutual recognition that serves purposes beyond the mere exchange of information. He continues his circuit of the trench, repeating the ritual with each surviving member of the section, cobbling together an assessment of readiness from these brief encounters. When he is gone, your attention returns to the blasted landscape beyond the parapet. The day is advancing toward evening, the quality of light changing subtly, casting longer shadows from the few shattered tree stumps that still protrude from the earth like accusatory fingers. In the distance, behind the German lines, a thin column of smoke rises from what might once have been a village, but is now merely a designation on artillery maps, a set of coordinates for destruction, rather than a place where people lived and worked. The order comes to stand down from immediate alert, to resume the normal watch rotation. You are not on the first shift, which means a brief opportunity for rest, for food, for the small maintenance tasks that fill the spaces between fighting and waiting to fight. You clean your rifle methodically, despite having fired only a few rounds during the day's sporadic exchanges. The action is soothing in its familiarity, in the controlled motions that require just enough concentration to momentarily displace other thoughts. As you work, you become aware of an absence to your right, the space previously occupied by Wilson, a Lancashire man with whom you've shared watch duty for weeks. The realization forms slowly, like an image developing on photographic paper. Wilson is gone, not temporarily absent on some duty, not rotated to another position, but gone in the permanent way that men disappear from the trenches. You cannot recall the specific moment of his going, whether taken by a shell during the barrage, by a sniper's bullet during a careless moment, by one of the myriad other mechanisms of removal that operate continuously along the front. You should feel something about this, you know. Wilson shared his cigarettes freely, spoke of his wife and infant daughter with quiet pride, had a talent for finding dry spots in which to place his ground sheet when the dugouts flooded. His absence represents a specific loss, a unique constellation of qualities that will not be replaced by the next draft of reinforcements. But the feeling, when you probe for it, is muffled, distant, as if packed in cotton wool and stored somewhere not easily accessible. This numbness is not new. It has been growing incrementally, a callus forming over the part of you that once responded with appropriate emotion to the suffering and death that surrounds you. Early in your time at the front, each loss cut sharply. The young lieutenant hit while leading a patrol, the company cook killed by a stray shell while delivering hot tea to the line, the machine gunner who developed pneumonia and was carried away, coughing blood onto his blanket. You marked these departures with genuine grief, with anger, with the terrible relief of him, not me, that brought its own burden of guilt. Now the reactions come by rote, performed rather than felt. You will write to Wilson's wife, if given the opportunity, using the same phrases you've employed in previous letters to other widows. You will divide his personal effects among those closest to him, as he would have done for you. You will mention his name in conversation, occasionally, keeping him present in the collective memory of the section, until new events and new losses push him further into the background. And eventually, you will have to search your memory for his face, for the sound of his voice, for the particulars that made him Wilson, rather than any other man who has passed through this trench on his way to oblivion. The realization of your own emotional atrophy brings a momentary flash of panic, a fear that something essential has been lost, that the capacity for normal human connection has been permanently damaged. But this too fades quickly, subsumed by the immediate demands of existence in this place, where feeling too deeply is a luxury none can afford for long. Night falls with the abruptness peculiar to the trenches, where the high walls cut off the lingering twilight that would be visible in the world above. Rations arrive, carried up from the rear, by men who move with the hunched posture of those accustomed to navigating spaces where standing upright invites death. The food is unidentifiable meat in congealed gravy, hard biscuits that must be softened in tea to avoid dental damage, jam that tastes primarily of sugar and chemicals. You eat mechanically, without pleasure or disgust, simply maintaining the body's requirements as you would maintain your rifle or any other essential equipment. After eating, those not on watch gather in the larger dugouts where candles or acetylene lamps provide pockets of yellow light in which men pursue the limited diversions available. Cards are popular, played for cigarettes, for small coins, or simply to pass time. Others write letters, the pencil moving hesitantly across paper as they construct sanitized versions of reality for consumption by those at home. A few read dog-eared novels or newspapers from home, escaping momentarily into narratives where endings are clear and conflicts resolvable. You find yourself seated on an ammunition box, listening as Peters, a former music hall performer, softly sings songs from another lifetime. His voice is gentle, deliberately kept low to avoid attracting attention from enemy listeners or officers concerned about morale. The tunes are familiar, sentimental ballads about sweethearts waiting faithfully, rousing patriotic numbers with choruses about glory and duty, comic songs that gently mock the hardships of army life while carefully avoiding its true horrors. Around you, other men join in, occasionally, humming when they don't know words, contributing a chorus when they do. The shared music creates a momentary communion, a tenuous connection between individuals who have learned to hold themselves apart as protection against the pain of loss. For these few minutes, the distance between souls decreases fractionally, allowing for a brief recognition of common humanity before the defensive barriers rise again. When Peters finishes his repertoire, a different kind of silence settles over the dugout, not the tense absence that follows a barrage, but a gentler emptiness tinged with melancholy. Men drift off to their sleeping spots, to watch duty, to the small private rituals that punctuate night in the trenches. You find your own place, a relatively dry corner where you've spread your ground sheet and the blanket that remains perpetually damp despite your best efforts. Sleep comes in fragments, interrupted by the routine sounds of the front line at night, occasional rifle fire, the distant rumble of transport bringing supplies to sectors beyond yours, the soft moans of men caught in nightmares, the scurrying of rats grown bold in the darkness. Each time you wake, there is a moment of disorientation, a brief window in which you might be anywhere before memory reasserts itself and places you firmly in this muddy ditch, in a corner of France, whose name you can pronounce, but whose significance in the larger strategy of war remains opaque. Dawn arrives as a gradual lightening of the narrow strip of sky visible from the trench bottom. With it comes the ritual of stand to, the daily acknowledgement of vulnerability during the changing light, when attacks are historically most common. You take your position, watching as no man's land emerges from darkness, its features clarifying with the strengthening day, the remains of previous attacks scattered across its surface, the tangles of wire glinting dully in the early light, the occasional movement that might be wind-stirred cloth or birds scavenging among remains. You prefer not to identify more specifically. The German trenches beyond are visible only as a slight discoloration in the earth, a horizontal line that represents the forward edge of their territory. Smoke rises from cooking fires behind their lines, mirroring the thin columns rising behind your own position. This mundane evidence of daily routine continuing on both sides creates a surreal juxtaposition with the wasteland that separates you, men preparing breakfast, a few hundred yards apart, but divided by a space where stepping into the open invites immediate death. As the threat of dawn attack recedes, the day's assignments are distributed. Your section is detailed for a working party repairing a portion of the support trench damaged in yesterday's barrage. The task requires movement to the rear, a welcome change from the claustrophobic confines of the front line, though not without its own dangers. Shelling is less consistent in the support areas, but often more random, with no pattern to learn and anticipate, no rhythm against which to time movement. The journey back through communication trenches takes nearly an hour, the narrow passages, clogged with men moving in both directions, reliefs heading to the front, wounded being evacuated to aid stations, runners carrying messages, ration parties delivering food and water. The etiquette of trench movement has become second nature. Flatten yourself against the wall when stretcher bearers approach. Give way to officers and men carrying crucial supplies. Avoid creating bottlenecks that might trap multiple soldiers in a vulnerable section should a shell find its mark. The support trench, when you reach it, shows the effects of yesterday's barrage. A section of wall collapsed, duckboards splintered, a dugout entrance partially blocked by fallen earth. The engineering sergeant outlines the required repairs with the brisk efficiency of a man who has rebuilt the same structures countless times, knowing their destruction is inevitable, but their maintenance essential. The work is physically demanding, but mentally uncomplicated. Sandbags must be filled, carried, and stacked to rebuild the damaged wall. Timber supports are salvaged from less damaged sections or brought forward from supply dumps. New duckboards are positioned to create walkways above the worst of the mud. The labor occupies your body fully, leaving limited capacity for thought beyond the immediate task, a relief from the endless waiting that characterizes much of trench existence. Around midday, the kitchen sends forward tea and a hot meal. Stew containing actual identifiable pieces of vegetable and meat, bread that might have been baked within the past day, even an orange for each man, a luxury that prompts more discussion than the morning's casualties. You eat seated on a fire step, savoring the relative freshness of the food, the simple pleasure of a meal consumed without the immediate pressure of possible combat. Conversation flows more easily here than in the front line. Men discuss rumors of leave rotations, the qualities of various officers, news from home letters, speculation about the significance of troop movements observed on roads behind the lines. The tone is carefully maintained within acceptable boundaries, neither descending into despair nor rising to unrealistic optimism. A balance has been struck, a middle ground where morale sustains itself through moderate expectations and small appreciations rather than grand hopes that experience has taught will likely be disappointed. After the meal, work resumes with slightly less energy, but continues steadily through the afternoon. As your section repairs the physical structure of the trench, you become aware of its dual nature, both protection and prison, both shield against enemy fire and constraint upon movement and choice. The paradox is central to trench existence. Safety requires limitations, survival demands constraint. The walls you rebuild will preserve lives and simultaneously confine them within a realm of experience so narrow, so divorced from normal human patterns, that it creates its own distorted reality. By late afternoon, the repairs are substantially complete. The sergeant inspects the work with professional scrutiny, noting minor deficiencies to be addressed, but generally satisfied with the result. The section gathers its tools, prepares for the return journey to the front line. As you wait for the order to move out, a voice calls your name, a runner from company headquarters, bearing a slip of paper that he hands to you with casual indifference to its significance in your personal narrative. The paper contains orders for a week's leave, beginning tomorrow. You stare at it incomprehendingly. At first, the reality of temporary escape from the trenches, too sudden, too unexpected to immediately process. Around you, reactions from comrades range from genuine pleasure to performative resentment, the latter softened by the knowledge that their own turns will come eventually, by the rotation system that distributes this scarce resource with reasonable equity. The return to the front line takes on a dreamlike quality, your awareness split between the immediate necessity of careful movement through communication trenches and the expanding realization that tomorrow you will board a transport to the rear, will eventually cross the channel, will walk streets where shells do not fall and mud does not reach to the knee. The disjunction between your present circumstance and this imminent future creates a cognitive dissonance that manifests as a slight disconnection from your surroundings, a muffling of perception. At the front line, you find your replacement already present, a young private recently arrived from England, his uniform still showing traces of its original color beneath the first accumulations of trench dirt. His face bears the expression common to new arrivals, a mixture of apprehension and determination, of preconceptions about warfare beginning their inevitable collision with reality. You show him your position, explain the pattern of enemy activity in your sector, point out landmarks in no man's land that may help orient him during watch. He asks questions that reveal both his training's inadequacy and his earnest desire to survive. How frequently does the enemy shell this section? Are there snipers particularly active at dawn? Which route to the latrine provides best cover? You answer with information stripped of emotional content, neither emphasizing dangers to the point of creating undue fear, nor minimizing them in ways that might encourage carelessness. This balance, you realize, is one more skill developed through months at the front, the ability to communicate essential knowledge without transmitting the psychological weight of experience that would be paralyzing if delivered all at once. Night falls as the handover continues. You assist your replacement in arranging his equipment in the dugout space you are vacating. Show him the least wet corner for his ground sheet, the small niche where a candle can burn protected from drafts. His gratitude for these minor kindnesses reminds you of your own first days, of the overwhelming disorientation that makes any guidance, however small, disproportionately valuable. The formalities of relief complete, you undertake your own preparations for departure. Equipment must be cleaned, personal items gathered, the accumulated detritus of months at the front sorted into what will accompany you on leave and what will remain. The process reveals how little of individual identity survives in the trenches. A few letters, perhaps a photograph carried in a pocketbook, small talismans or keepsakes that connect to the world beyond. The material evidence of your existence here could be gathered in a single haversack, leaving barely a trace that you specifically, rather than any other soldier, occupied this place. As you work, awareness grows of the peculiar burden of survival, the obligation felt toward those who remain, particularly those who have arrived more recently, and look to you as a source of guidance. You find yourself offering advice to men nearby, small fragments of wisdom accumulated through experience, the safest route to the aid station, which supply sergeant can be persuaded to provide extra socks, how to detect the distinctive sound of an incoming Minenwerfer before it lands. The sharing of knowledge serves multiple purposes: practical assistance to others, affirmation of your own value derived from experience, and perhaps most significantly, a hedge against the superstition that surrounds imminent departure from the front. To speak as if you will not return invites fate's attention to act as if your accumulated knowledge still matters, still requires transmission, is to suggest to whatever gods or forces govern survival that your story remains unfinished, that your role in this vast machinery of war continues beyond temporary absence. Sleep on this final night comes with surprising ease, the certainty of tomorrow's departure, creating a buffer between consciousness and the usual anxieties that populate darkness in the trenches. Dreams, when they come, are fragmented collages of memory and anticipation, images of home intercut with scenes from the front, familiar faces from civilian life superimposed on landscapes of mud and wire. You wake several times, momentarily confused about where and when you are, the boundaries between different realities temporarily permeable in the liminal space between sleeping and waking. Dawn brings your last stand to for at least a week, perhaps longer if delays in the transportation system work in your favor. You watch the gradual illumination of no man's land with different eyes than usual, cataloging details, not for tactical significance, but as images to be stored, to be carried away as representational samples of an experience that defies complete description. The particular pattern of wire against the lightening sky, the precise curve of a shell hole's edge, the way moisture beads on the surface of mud, these small observations become suddenly precious, not for their beauty, but for their specificity, their capacity to anchor memory in concrete detail, rather than generalized impression. After stand down, you collect your minimal luggage and make your farewells. These are deliberately casual, shaped by superstition and the peculiar emotional economy of the front line. To make too much of departure is to acknowledge the statistical reality that not all present will survive until your return. To make too little is to deny the bonds, however carefully limited, that have formed through shared hardship. The result is a performance of nonchalance penetrated by brief moments of genuine connection, a sustained handshake, a specific request for items from home, a promise to buy a drink, post-war that both parties recognize may never be fulfilled, but offer nonetheless as affirmation of possible futures. The journey away from the front line reverses your arrival path of months ago. Communication trenches lead to support areas. Support areas give way to reserve positions. Reserve positions eventually open onto roads where movement is less restricted, where walking fully upright becomes possible without invoking immediate danger. Each transition marks a gradual decompression, a slow release from the concentrated pressure of frontline existence into progressively more diluted versions of war. As physical distance from the front increases, you become increasingly conscious of your appearance, your smell, the visible and invisible marks that identify you as recently emerged from the trenches. Your uniform bears the unmistakable pattern of trench occupancy, mud that has dried in horizontal layers, marking the different heights to which you've been immersed, stains whose origins you prefer not to examine too closely, tears repaired with the crude stitching that is the best most soldiers can manage. Beneath the uniform, your body carries its own evidence, skin irritated by lice and prolonged dampness, the peculiar pallor that develops in men who live primarily underground, small wounds and abrasions whose origins you no longer remember specifically. At the divisional rest area, procedures for men on leave are efficiently established. You surrender certain equipment items that will be reissued upon return, receive back pay that has accumulated during months at the front, are directed through a cleansing process that includes hot showers, delousing, and the issue of a uniform that, while not new, at least approximates the appearance expected of soldiers in rear areas and on home territory. The physical transformation is striking, but incomplete. Looking at yourself in a mirror, a rare experience after months limited to small shaving glasses, or the reflection in standing water, you see a face that seems simultaneously familiar and strange. The features are recognizable, but somehow differently arranged, as if subtle shifts have occurred in the underlying structure. Most notable are the eyes, which return your gaze with an expression that would have been alien to your pre-war self, a particular combination of wariness, exhaustion, and knowledge that no civilian context could have produced. The transport to the coast is crowded with others on leave, creating a temporary community, united by shared destination and recent escape from the front. Conversation is more animated than in the trenches, but still bounded by unspoken limits. Certain topics are avoided by mutual consent, specific horrors witnessed, fears about return, doubts about the war's purpose or progress. Instead, discussion focuses on immediate plans for leave, recommendations for establishments in London or other cities, stories of previous leave experiences that emphasize humor or small adventures rather than the darker aspects of temporary re-entry into civilian space. As France passes outside the train windows, you observe the gradual transition from war-dominated landscape to areas where normal life continues, despite distant artillery, whose rumble is now felt more as vibration than heard as sound. Fields are cultivated, though often by women, children, or old men, rather than the young men now occupying trenches. Villages show damage from earlier stages of the war, but have adapted around it, civilian routines continuing in structures partially collapsed, lives rebuilding around the edges of destruction in the resilient pattern that humans have always established in the wake of calamity. The contrast between these scenes and the wasteland of the front produces a sensation of unreality, a feeling that one of these worlds must be illusory because their simultaneous existence seems impossible. How can life continue with such apparent normalcy, just miles from where men tear each other apart in mud and wire? The cognitive dissonance increases as the journey continues, as evidence of war recedes, and markers of ordinary existence multiply. At the port, efficiency again characterizes the processing of men on leave. Documents are checked, transport arranged, warnings delivered about maintaining appropriate behavior while representing the army on home territory. The channel crossing, when it finally occurs, creates a physical barrier between war and temporary peace that reinforces the psychological transition already underway. Standing at the rail, watching France recede into distance and eventual invisibility, you experience a complex emotion that encompasses relief, survivor's guilt, anticipation, and apprehension about re-entering a world whose norms and expectations now seem alien after months of trench existence. England, when it appears on the horizon, seems impossibly green, its colors saturated beyond what memory prepared you to perceive. The approaching shoreline represents safety in its most literal sense, ground not subject to artillery bombardment, space where movement need not be calculated for minimum exposure to enemy observation, air uncontaminated by gas or the constant miasma of trench smells. Yet alongside appreciation of these objective advantages runs an unexpected anxiety, a realization that safety itself has become unfamiliar, that the hypervigilance developed for survival at the front will now be not only unnecessary but potentially problematic in civilian interaction. Docking initiates a new phase of processing, more document checks, transportation arrangements to London or directly to home destinations for those who live nearer the coast, repeated reminders of regulations governing uniform standards and conduct while on leave. You move through these procedures with the practiced patience of a soldier accustomed to bureaucratic management, your thoughts increasingly drawn toward what awaits beyond these final barriers. The train to London contains a mixture of soldiers on leave and civilians going about ordinary business. The latter regard military passengers with expressions ranging from respectful deference to poorly concealed curiosity to deliberate neutrality that masks whatever their true reactions might be. You find yourself categorizing these civilians automatically, sorting them by age, gender, apparent social class, not from genuine interest, but as an extension of the constant environmental assessment that has become second nature at the front. What strikes you most forcefully is their cleanliness, their wholeness, their apparent freedom from constant fear. The woman applies powder to her face from a compact mirror, concerned with aesthetic details that would be laughably irrelevant in the trenches. A businessman reads a newspaper with focused attention on financial reports, on political developments without immediate connection to the war, on sporting results from games being played despite the absence of so many young men. A child sleeps against his mother's shoulder, completely vulnerable in a way that would be unthinkable at the front, where such unconsciousness would represent mortal danger. London, when you arrive, assaults your senses with its intactness, its functioning normality, its sheer solidity. Buildings stand complete and undamaged. Streets follow logical patterns rather than the zigzag necessities of communication trenches. People move without the hunched posture of those expecting shells from above. The noise is different too, the mechanical sounds of vehicles and commerce rather than artillery, the human sounds of conversation and laughter rather than commands and cries of pain. You make your way to the address provided for overnight accommodation before continuing to your home tomorrow. The building is a requisitioned hotel, now dedicated to housing soldiers on leave, a transitional space between war and civilian life. Inside, you find a room shared with 3 others, all recently arrived from the front, though from different sectors than your own. The beds seem impossibly clean, the sheets startlingly white against the remembered background of mud-colored existence. The availability of hot water, of soap that actually removes dirt rather than merely redistributing it, of towels that begin and end their use dry rather than damp. These simple amenities acquire the quality of extreme luxury. Evening brings the opportunity to venture into London properly. You change into the fresh uniform issued at the rest area, attempt to arrange yourself into the appearance of a soldier on legitimate leisure rather than a frontline survivor temporarily displaced. The mirror shows a reasonable approximation of military correctness, though nothing can quite disguise the particular quality of movement, of watchfulness, that marks men recently removed from the trenches. In the streets, you encounter the strange theater of wartime London, a performance of normalcy underlaid with the constant awareness of conflict. Restaurants serve meals on white tablecloths, but with portions calculated according to rationing regulations. Theaters present comedies and music hall reviews that incorporate patriotic elements, while primarily offering escape from war consciousness. Pubs serve alcohol in quantities limited by law, but still sufficient to create the temporary oblivion that many on leave seek as aggressively as they have sought physical safety at the front. You choose a pub recommended by a sergeant who shared your compartment on the train, finding it populated by a mixture of civilians and military personnel. The latter are easily identified, not just by uniform, but by a particular quality of controlled release, men allowing themselves measured enjoyment while maintaining the discipline that has become essential to survival. Conversations around you touch on the war, but obliquely, through humor, through carefully edited anecdotes, through discussions of specific places or units that avoid the larger questions of purpose or progress. Ordering a beer, your first in months, you find a corner seat that places your back to the wall, allowing observation of the entire room, a position chosen automatically based on habits of vigilance developed in environments where threats might come from multiple directions. The beer tastes different from memory, or perhaps your palate has changed, recalibrated by months of army tea and water purified with chemicals that leave a distinctive aftertaste. You drink slowly, conscious of alcohol's effects on a body unaccustomed to it after the enforced sobriety of frontline service. A civilian at a nearby table notices your regimental insignia, approaches to ask questions about conditions over there, his manner combining genuine concern with the voyeuristic interest of those safely distant from what they inquire about. You provide responses that satisfy social expectations while revealing almost nothing of significance, the practice performance of the soldier on leave, who understands that civilian listeners want reassurance rather than reality, confirmation of narratives presented in newspapers rather than the complex, often sordid truth of trench existence. Later, returning to your temporary accommodation, you walk London streets, transformed by wartime regulations, lights dimmed against potential air raids, police and military personnel visible at key points, posters exhorting civilians to various forms of participation in the war effort. The contrast between this modified version of peace and the absolute abnormality of the front creates a disorienting double vision, as if you are simultaneously inhabiting two incompatible realities. Sleep comes with unexpected difficulty, despite physical comfort, far exceeding anything available in the trenches. The bed's softness seems excessive, after months of earth floors or wooden planks covered by a thin ground sheet. The silence, relative by London standards, but profound compared to the constant background symphony of the front, creates a void that imagination fills with remembered sounds of artillery, of whiz-bangs, of machine guns in the distance. The darkness is wrong too, complete when you close your eyes, rather than broken by flares, by distant explosions, by the routine illumination of no man's land that prevents surprises from emerging out of night. Morning brings the final stage of your journey, the train to the small town where your family waits, unaware of your imminent arrival, due to the uncertainties of leave scheduling that make precise notification impossible. As rural England passes outside the windows, its peaceful fields and undamaged villages create an increasingly pronounced sense of disconnection from the reality you have inhabited for months. This landscape, though familiar from childhood, now seems improbably intact, suspiciously undisturbed, as if you have crossed not just the channel but some boundary between possible worlds. Arriving at the small station where you departed, what feels like a lifetime ago, you experience a moment of profound dislocation. The physical structures unchanged, while you yourself have been so fundamentally altered that returning to this fixed point creates a cognitive dissonance, almost physical in its intensity. The station master nods in recognition, offers a respectful greeting that acknowledges your uniform without specific reference to where you have been or what you have experienced. His reticence is typical of civilian interaction with returning soldiers, an awareness that questions might activate responses better left dormant, that the gap between front experience and home understanding is potentially unbridgeable. The walk to your parents' house follows a route embedded in memory since childhood, feet moving automatically, while consciousness catalogues small changes accumulated during your absence. A new sign above the butcher's shop, fresh paint on the vicarage gate, the absence of younger men who must now be somewhere along the Western Front, perhaps even in trenches near the one you so recently vacated. These observations occupy the foreground of awareness, while deeper currents of emotion build beneath: anticipation of reunion, anxiety about how to communicate across the experiential divide, uncertainty about how much of yourself remains compatible with the person your family expects to embrace. Your mother sees you first, through the front window as you approach the gate, Her expression transforms from casual interest in a passing figure to recognition, to a complex mixture of joy and something else, perhaps a momentary glimpse of the changes written in your posture, your gait, the set of your shoulders beneath the uniform that now fits you differently than when it was first issued. She calls to your father, disappears from the window, and then the front door opens as you reach the garden path.